Hey all, here's an evergreen conversation I had with Renee Hobbs, a professor of propaganda literacy at the Bioneers Conference in California last year. The subject was misinformation, truthiness, and critical thinking, seeing through the madness by enhancing media literacy for all, meaning all of us. I hope you'll listen and share this. Take care.
You forget when you look at your technology now that even scrolling is a device. Scrolling is an actively designed way to take you down, literally, into the place someone else wants you to be. And that all feels dark and weird and confusing. And here we are with a president and a cabinet and in a world where information is no longer not even close to reliable, where people in positions of authority are making shit up to keep it simple. But it takes me back to the 20th century for those of us who grew up mostly in the 20th century, when it seemed so much easier, right? Walter Cronkite at our kitchen table in the 1960s would say that's the way it is. And yet, even in those days, there were problems. I was looking back through the history. We have a car magnate, and of course a SpaceX magnate now who's controlling information. Henry Ford, who was a fascist and an anti-Semite, when he was selling his Model Ts in the early 1920s, he pressed his dealers to put a copy of his newspaper, his anti-Semitic newspaper, into the Model T that you got. So it's weird how we're actually repeating a cycle that happened in a very much a non-digital age. So there's something here that's bigger than just these gadgets that we're playing with. And I reached out 5 years ago to this luminary who's an invaluable person in helping us not only individually understand propaganda and how to discriminate reality or pursue it in a complex media environment, but how to teach it to others. And what I hope today is we can all figure out how not just to be wiser consumers of our own individual information spheres, but how to think about how we can spread the knowledge. And at the end, I'll show you her, Renee Hobbs' website. It's mindovermedia.us, not .org. So mindovermedia.us is a good portal to the book that's out there at the bookstall. And Renee Hobbs, I want to just introduce you, University of Rhode Island, professor of media literacy, a teacher of propaganda literacy, and I thought we would start with something that we talked about 5 years ago, which is the word propaganda, because it kind of jarred me. I grew up thinking of that as it's a bad thing. It's like the Mao posters that my brother had in his dorm room, but it's different. So could you just talk about propaganda, and then we're going to get going, and we'll have lots of time for audience interaction.
Sure, Andy. It's really an honor to be here. It's been so rejuvenating to be in rooms full of activists and community engaged scientists and scholars, and so I don't want to shock anybody here, but some of you, in fact, probably most of you, are propagandists. Okay? Yes, it's true, right? And the word propaganda got a very bad reputation in the 20th century, right? The Third Reich's control over information, entertainment, the arts, and the culture completely transformed the meaning of that word into a dirty word. But it didn't start off to be a dirty word. It actually started off from a place in the heart. Because in the 17th century, the Catholic Church worried about the loss of faith and the decline of interest in concepts like love and forgiveness, decided to create a special organization that was the propaganda arm of the Catholic Church. And it was responsible for sending missions to hither, thither, and yon. Of course, that was a mixed bag indeed, right? But the idea of propaganda came from the idea of spreading the good news. It came from a very positive place, spreading the good news and doing it in a way that would unite people around a set of common goals. Now, this was so much the understanding of propaganda that in the 20th century, and as we were coming into the Great War, right? The British and Americans for the first time really used striking visual messages and short slogans to try to get people to enlist in the war effort, to sign up, to go be troops, and to give money to the cause. And that is how we began thinking about propaganda. So my undergraduate students, when I ask them what is propaganda, they say, oh, it's those posters from World War II. It's like, no. It's much bigger than that.
Well, I remember you told me that, right, they have the sense of it was something old. It was also just not just something that's in the world right now.
And the big aha was, oh, a meme is like a modern day propaganda poster. And it's like, yes, propaganda lives at the intersection of information, entertainment, and persuasion. So if you draw the Venn diagrams, you kind of can see how propaganda wants to activate your strong emotions. It wants to simplify information to its very essence. It sometimes attacks opponents and critics, like the Catholic Church did, because they were not crazy about those new Protestants that were, coming up to change their understanding of words like love and forgiveness. But most of all, propaganda can't work without appealing to people's deepest hopes, fears, and dreams. So when I'm trying to help my students recognize propaganda, I sometimes say, look for those 4 powerful techniques. Activate strong emotions, simplify information and ideas, appeal to people's deepest hopes, fears, and dreams, and sometimes attack opponents. And now I think it's probably easier for you to see how you might be a propagandist, especially in this age where, thanks to social media, anyone can share a powerful story, post, or message that has a propaganda objective. Activists have to use propaganda, right? It's actually part of our toolkit. So the question is, can we distinguish or differentiate between beneficial propaganda and harmful propaganda? That's a little bit harder.
Yeah, and I guess then we get to, we're going to do a whole bit of this discussion on the reception part. How do you identify it, and how do you then assess in your own way what's positive or negative as well? One thing that's weird about the media environment we're in now is there's no single audience either. Right. We talk about mass media, but that doesn't mean everyone is experiencing the information out there and getting the same reaction from the information. As a journalist, I started out on the climate beat in the 1980s and writing about biodiversity and all that stuff. But journalism was still this sort of, I go out and report, I write my story, I publish it in the New York Times or in magazines I was at, and maybe I'd get 5 or 10 letters maybe, and that was it. It was this kind of some presumption, like the church or something, we're the authority, we're putting it out there, you just digest it. And then as the climate issue became more complicated and contentious in the sort of the aughts, the 2000s, I started for the first time. I'd already been reporting on this since the 80s. And in 2006 was like the first time I interviewed a social scientist about the climate problem. And it was a huge oh my God moment, because all of this information that Helen Ingram, who is at UC Irvine, on that particular day, and then forward talking to many other behavioral scientists, I realized that information actually doesn't change people most of the time. We filter on the basis of our predispositions, or how we were raised, maybe even a little bit about our biology. you can have two brothers who grow up and have different reactions to information as well.
Yeah.
So how important is it, either as a producer of positive propaganda or as a consumer, to think about that behavioral reality?
Right.
That there is no, you might have one message you're selling, but we're not all seeing it the same way.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And of course, the fragmentation of audiences means that, when I go to Google and I do a search, my Google is not your Google. And when I go to Netflix to see what I want to watch, what movies I want to watch, my Netflix looks completely different from your Netflix or your Netflix, right? And it turns out that hyper-fragmentation makes it really challenging for authors and audiences. One thing as an audience member is I've lost a common ground, right? No longer can I make any assumptions that my students are familiar with the movies and the TV shows and the celebrities and the influencers and the journalists that I'm familiar with. It takes more effort to figure out where do we have a common understanding of reality. And that creates opportunities for propaganda to thrive in niche communities, right? Where we have this natural bias to believe what we believe, to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs. And a lot of people in the audience are familiar with that term, confirmation bias, right? It's this hardwired aspect of it's kind of cognitively, it's kind of efficient, It's just, have an understanding of the world and seek out information that aligns with that and ignore the other stuff, right? That's actually a coping strategy, especially in an age of information overload. But we know for sure that we can't confront people who have different beliefs than ours, who have different perceptions of reality. We can't confront them with facts and expect them to change. And we've got such great research on that. It's unbelievable. Facts don't change people's minds. Feelings do, right? And so I really recommend a wonderful book by a guy named Gerard McRaney. The book is called How Minds Change. And he said something that I think is very relevant to Bioneer's audience, and especially the broadly interdisciplinary way you are as a community. McRaney surveys a whole lot of psychology and social psychology research, and he makes a great synthesis explaining how minds really do change. And what we know best is it works something like this. Let's just pretend I'm trying to change your mind, Andy, okay? I'm trying to change your mind. Because you believe something I don't really understand or hold to or believe to be true. You state your belief and you explain what it is. Go ahead, can you make something up? Something you believe in strongly that's really important to you. I'm going to try to change your mind.
Okay, I believe that it's hard to take nuclear energy off of the list of energy choices if we want to have a stable climate.
Whoa. I think you just said that it's hard to take nuclear energy off the list if you're going to try to think about a stable climate.
Yeah.
Wow. So, why do you think that, Andy?
Because it produces a lot of energy with no emissions of greenhouse gases.
And so why does that matter?
Because greenhouse gases are changing the climate substantially in ways that are hard to reverse.
Wow. So notice that the first step of the change process is that I asked him to explain himself, and he offered evidence and reasoning, and I listened with respect. Check. Now, step one. Step two. Here it comes, Andy. Are you ready for it?
No.
On a scale of 100 to 1, with 100 meaning you're 100% positive that everything you just said is true, to 1 meaning you only have a 1% belief that everything you just said is true. What number would you say reflects your certainty
85%.
Why did he pick 85?
Because there are big challenges with getting nuclear energy established in places where it doesn't already exist.
Uh-huh.
And because worst case things can happen.
Uh-huh. Any other reasons for your 85% ranking?
That's
pretty good.
There might be some others.
It's pretty good. You can tell he's really thought about this deeply, right? Because he got those answers out in that journalistically crisp and tight formulation. The rest of us mere mortals, we don't speak that crisply. It takes us hours to explain ourselves, right? But Andy's really good at that. So here's the cool thing that the researchers found is that when you demonstrate the intellectual humility to know that you're not 100% certain and that there's a possibility that you might be wrong, then you become more open to information that doesn't align with your existing belief system. You actually are aware that you might learn something from people who have a different perspective, and you will be open to learning from them. Isn't that a beautiful way that minds actually change? Intellectual humility plus self-awareness of our fallibility plus being open to learning. I think that's what makes making minds change really exciting and something we should be optimistic about.
It sounds good. And to me, I'm still not sure. I'll have to read that book.
It's good.
But a lot of what I've learned, especially as a blogger in this space, .earth at the New York Times, was 9 years, 100,000 comments, all of which I mediated myself. Sorry. I learned, I think to me, it's more about opening space, finding a little bit of common ground, and then moving forward with some possibilities, especially with things like energy policy, where it will always be a negotiated and complicated. Creating the space to have that conversation is essential.
Yeah.
But then you take that online and it feels harder.
Yeah.
Do you find that how do we create the atmosphere can lead to what we just did?
Yeah. I think we have to, like everything, finding common ground is like a muscle that needs to be exercised. And I want to share with you a story of a really cool new media literacy, it's like a learning activity that I just saw and I've been so intrigued about because it's a tool that uses generative AI to get people to become more aware of how their language embodies their ideologies and how their language can create barriers to other people listening. It's a very funny little platform called Bust Out of the Silos, which itself is a great name, right? Bust out of the silos. And so you are given an AI coach, a bot, a thought partner, and you are given a paragraph to read. And it's a paragraph about a topic you have strong opinions about because you're a liberal or because you're a conservative. And you're asked to explain that paragraph in a single sentence. And so you type in your sentence, and the bot points out that you used certain words that might be barriers to other people's comprehension. And so you're asked, and they point that out. They point out these words, right? Progressive. You know, whatever the words are. So then you're asked to revise your sentence in relation to making sure you get through to that person on the other side, right? On the other side of the aisle. And so through a process of practicing, you become more aware of how your language can open up doors for other people to listen to you or shut them down. And I'd never seen generative AI used that way as like a writing coach. But wow, what a good writing coach it is. And it didn't take me very long to see how fun the game was, so that when the game then said, okay, now do you want to flip and see if you can do it from the other side? Do you want to essentially pretend to be a conservative and try to persuade a liberal of your conservative beliefs? I was like, sure, I'll try it. I wasn't as good at that. But I recognized the way in which there are these, and Neil Postman talked about this 30 years ago, right? He said there are these words that stop people's thinking. He called them smear words. And so if we can avoid smear words, we can open up the possibility to connect to people's hearts.
So much of that seems to start with the practice of listening a lot first also. That's something, you see, journalists historically, you think we're listening a lot.
You're terrible listeners.
Because I'm interviewing you, but we're so often in the history of my journalism, and when I look at journalism, you do your interview, you're waiting for the person to say the thing you're then going to stick in the story.
Yeah.
To put them in a position of playing a part in the drama of an article.
Yeah.
And that is not active listening.
Yeah, no.
So I think that
Yeah.
what was revealed to me through all this reporting I did through this, like 2006 and onward, and through talking to people like you, is that there's not just science here, but there are practices and norms that can break free. At Columbia University, where I worked for 4 years, Peter Coleman, a psychologist, has a difficult conversation laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
And he started out in deep conflict in international issues like Israel, Gaza, Palestine, negotiations and the like. And that learning their practices and how they do that was so valuable to me in thinking about how to present in my blog or whatever issues. And also Ted Keel, who was a famous labor negotiator in New York City, who was a philanthropist for environmental programs and projects. I got to know this guy, and he talked about when he was doing a labor deal negotiation. He said there's an anatomy of a dispute. Some are contractual, some are based on history, some are based on these things. But there's a methodology. This is not like, oh my God, what do we do? What do we do? Right. Do you think that most people that you meet to talk to about issues like this are not aware of the fact that there are all these practices and possibilities?
I think people are hungry for strategies that help restore our democracy. And I think we understand that democracy revolves around finding consensus and building consensus across stakeholder communities. And one of the things that we did at the Media Education Lab at the University of Rhode Island is we read Amanda Ripley's wonderful book, High Conflict. This book was the book that pushed a finger at journalists and said, journalists are terrible listeners, and until journalists start to listen, we're going to not have good journalism, basically. And she helped us. Her work was really instrumental in a program that we ultimately reached about 1,200 people across Rhode Island and across the United States. The program was called Courageous Rhode Island. And what it did was identified a series of 10 courageous conversations. And these were all conversations that had to do with media, technology, and society. So one of the courageous conversations was about conflict entrepreneurs. These folks are masters of propaganda. Conflict entrepreneurs are people who use conflict for pleasure, power, and profit. And this, as a communicative strategy, means that we all have exposure to different kinds of conflict entrepreneurs in our social media feed, actually, and in our workplace. How about that friend who always comes into the room at lunch hour and says something and then makes it worse, right? Makes the drama even more intense, right? Conflict entrepreneurs happen in our families, in our workplace, and in our media sphere. And what we found is that we could through online dialogue create a safe space where people could practice noticing the conflict entrepreneurs that they have in their families, in their workplace, and in their communities, recognizing that sometimes conflict can be beneficial right? And conflict, there's good conflict, and conflict can actually help people get closer to consensus. But then also a place where people can reflect on, so what actions do I take to minimize the harms and risks of the conflict entrepreneurs that show up on my digital devices? What actions can I take to move that further away from my mindset, because it's just such a black hole of attention wasting. Right. So I think conflict entrepreneurs, understanding about good conflict, recognizing propaganda when it's targeted to different audiences, because it's pretty easy for us to recognize propaganda when it's targeted to other people. But we often, when propaganda is targeted to us, it seems like entertainment. Take, for example, Jon Stewart and The Daily Show and John Oliver and all my other favorite journalism comedians. Right. I see that as entertainment. But I actually have to acknowledge that it functions as propaganda. And so that means I have to be a little bit self-aware of the way in which propaganda is operating in my life, right, in ways that I might tend to trivialize or dismiss.
You're reminding me of something that Peter Coleman at Columbia told me once when I had him on my webcast that's relevant. This is the guy from the Difficult Conversations Laboratory. I said to him, you know, my vision, I used to have this vision at the New York Times, which had an opinion section feature called Room for Debate. I said I was trying to press my colleagues to shift it to Room for Agreement. And he said, yeah, but that's not what, your goal shouldn't be agreement, it should be cooperation, room for cooperation, which I think, I don't know, I'd like to get your opinion on this, but to me it was a breakthrough in my own thinking, because most of the time the outcome of a very difficult negotiation isn't victory, defeat, it isn't agreement, it's cooperation on something. Yeah. Does that feel?
Yeah, I think that seems
like
right.
An important distinction?
I think that's an important distinction, and I think it's also like it lowers the bar, right? So we don't have to agree with everybody. In fact, when we did our trainings for Courageous Conversations, we had to keep reminding people, you don't have to agree with someone, right, to listen to them. You don't have to try to persuade them either, right? You can just listen with an open heart. But I'm actually aware that some of the norms of journalism have become infected across our whole society now. And one of them is the journalistic bias toward conflict and controversy, which is kind of baked into the business model. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would. which is why I try to do it differently in my Substack thing.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about that. I have a question for you on this, because Absolutely. Some people have said to me, oh, Substack, that's just another place where propaganda thrives. And I actually thought, I'm not really sure about that. I don't really use it that much, but what little I do use of it comes from journalists who are finding that Substack is a place where they can make a living doing the work they do without the institutional motherships that journalists used to rely on. So do you think, is Substack full of propaganda, or is it more full of journalism?
It's become very large, so I don't think there's a way. I haven't seen anyone assess it that way yet. I think you can, like in any other medium or platform, you can find what you want. There are Nazis on Substack. That doesn't mean you have to seek them and or find them. Right. They're using it. It's a tool, just like turning on a two-way radio. You know, it's a tool. Right. There are enormous numbers of people I go to Substack for, not just to spread my own gospel, my own propaganda, but to learn from. And today, just this morning, with the horrible news of the Myanmar earthquake, rather than writing something myself, I've reported a lot on earthquake risk along with climate. There are these two seismologists who are on Substack, and they do very quick turnaround, really interesting, informed deep dives on the seismology behind these terrible events, and I reposted their piece. So it can be a community function that's really valuable. The same thing happens on Twitter and on other platforms are not very useful that way. Facebook and LinkedIn, well, they all have this different kind of flavor. LinkedIn is like resume trading, but Mongabay, like Rhett Butler, who some of you have heard here, he's fantastic at using LinkedIn to convey the work of his journalism network on tropical forests and the like. So it's not so much the platform as the intent. Yeah. And I think if we all find our way, whether you're a producer of information or a consumer who then is sort of trying to propagate that's that same kind of word, reliable information, you find it anywhere, including still on X, believe it or not. Right. It's right. A matter of how you use these things, right. Which maybe we can talk about that now. What are some of the practices for in this environment, not just as a recipient of information, but as a right. getting into the content creation, I guess is the word now.
Right. Well, I think that intermediate position of sharing is something worth reflecting on a little bit, right? Because it used to be you were an author or an audience. But now there's this intermediate position where right. You can amplify the voices of other authors by sharing. And you can signal your alliances, your allegiances, your identity position by copying and sharing. There's a legal scholar named Rebecca Tushnet at Harvard Law School, and she has a really interesting take on copying. She says that back in the day, right, during the early years of our country's birth, that it was very, very common for people to, George Washington did it, and lots of others, to write down the words of famous, thoughtful people in your own little notebook, right? And you'd copy the ideas of these people whose sentences you admired, whose ideas you'd admired. You'd copy those into your own little workbook. And that would help you more firmly understand the powerful ideas. And that copying would be a way for you to form an identity position about your values. She said, and I really appreciate this, that now in an era of social media, when we share, we're doing something like that, right? We're signaling to ourselves and to the people around us, these are the ideas I really respect and value. And so I think this idea that, we're unfortunately in schools we say to kids, oh, don't copy, right. Don't share, right? And don't cut and paste, whatever you do. But actually, some aspect of copying and pasting is actually kind of good practice for identity, for understanding rhetorical effectiveness, mm-hmm. and for thinking about one's own social responsibilities. Because sharing wisely is a challenge. And I don't know, let's have a moment of come to Jesus now. Raise your hand if you've ever shared something that you later regretted sharing. I have. Yeah. It happens, and it happens to the best of us. And hopefully those experiences are learning experiences for us, but I think to share or not to share is one of those big Shakespearean ideas that we need to keep thinking about and keep helping each other and holding each other accountable for when we share in ways that do more harm than good.
Yeah, no, and I think it's important to learn from the mistakes too, or at least me as a communicator, even as a journalist. The New York Times, some of the worst errors of the New York Times were never acknowledged. They're just kind of skate on. The big high level things like Stalin and having a reporter who won a Pulitzer Prize in Russia, who's a propagandist, but you never see a correction, that kind of thing. But to me, like when I did misshare, one day I was Hurricane Harvey. Anyone here from Texas? During Hurricane Harvey, someone had been floating around a photo of a Delta airliner on a flooded runway. And I thought it perfectly illustrated some issues I deal with, related to climate and bad flash flooding. And I retweeted it. And very quickly, Steve McIntyre, who's kind of a climate skeptic, but someone who is sort of a reasonable skeptic, who I respect, he posted hey man, this was from one of the environmental groups had made it as a photo illustration, unrelated to Hurricane Harvey, that just then was magnified and floating around. And I wrote about that. I used that as an opportunity on my blog to say, hey, here, and when I was teaching at Pace University, a course called Blogging a Better Planet, one of their weekly assignments was what I called a backtrack journal. Find something that crossed your screen, that caught your attention, that grabbed you either positively or negatively, and track it back. Where did it actually come from? Where was it generated?
It's a great media literacy practice.
And I think propagating that,
yeah,
just so we have a little bit in the back of our heads, some sense of what to do.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you a little bit. I want to talk to this audience a little bit about a term you use that might not be familiar to everybody. It's familiar to journalists, but it's not familiar to everybody. You said that photo was a photo illustration. Raise your hands if you've heard that term before. Yeah, some people have, but not everybody. Photo illustration. A photo illustration is a manipulated photo, right? That's used to explain a concept, but it's not a documentary photo, right? And photo illustrations are hard to spot sometimes.
Harder than ever.
Harder than ever. And we've been worried about photo illustrations since the 1980s, when New York Times photojournalist Fred Ritchie wrote a book about the risks of Photoshop, that Photoshop would create an opportunity for unreal realities to thrive. And of course, I've been thinking about that since I read that book in the 80s. And then only recently, really, as I grow older, I get more interested in history, right? As it always is. And realizing that people have been worried about the unreal realities that technology and media and language can bring for thousands of years. And it's really an interesting exercise to pay attention to how many unreal realities you encounter in just a morning. In just a morning, watch the news and try to do your work and notice the unreal realities that are part of your daily life. So I think in some ways, heightening consciousness, a big part of media literacy education is generally just heightening people's awareness of the media in their lives so they notice and wonder about who made it, why did they make it, what techniques are they using to attract and hold attention, and what's their point of view? What are they trying to accomplish? Doing that wakens people up, awakens people to be more self-conscious and aware of their media consumption, and that helps them to make better choices.
So now I want to go to, you have a handout. It's
do.
not homework, but it's a handout.
I have a handout.
And we're going to talk a little bit about
Who's going to help me
practices.
With the handout? Thank you, my friend. Who's going to help me with the handout for over here in this column? Can you help me pass out?
And we're going to move pretty quickly to your questions too, obviously. And back in the Voice of God, folks, can you turn on the screen? But not that. That isn't. That's not my computer. Whose computer is that? Wrong computer.
You can share with a friend if you're not close to it.
Back behind this. That's someone else's computer.
So I want to introduce you to my media literacy remote control. If you are holding one, will you hold it up? Okay. Thank you so much. So you'll notice that, well, first of all, let me just say, it's not a real phone. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for thinking critically about the media that I developed more than 30 years ago when, as a very young teacher, I was sometimes called in to talk to public school teachers about media literacy at the end of a long day. They'd been in the classroom for 6 hours dealing with children. And then the principal says, and now Professor Hobbs will speak to you about media literacy. And it's like, oh my God. They were exhausted. I was exhausted. What the heck? They just wanted to go home. So when I only had 5 minutes to talk about media literacy, I would show this metaphor. Notice that you can use the media literacy remote control or smartphone now with any kind of media, books, news media, websites, TV, movies, comics, video games, social media, music. My college students go, wait, books are media? They thought that was a different category. I'm like, no, books are media. Yeah, that's right. Notice that you can use the media literacy smartphone with anything. And here's how it works. It's not hard. First of all, let's press the buttons on the app. Press the reality check button, and instantly comes flooding into your consciousness the answer to the question, what is accurate and inaccurate about this message? Whew, that's cool. Press the private gain or public good button, and you instantly get the answer to the question, who's making money from this message? Who's benefiting financially from this message? Press the what's left out button, and you instantly get what's omitted, which is the greatest way to spot a person's bias or point of view. Notice what they're not telling you. Notice what they've not included. That's because all media are selective and incomplete. They have to leave stuff out. Notice what's omitted. You spot the point of view. Values check. We're drawn to messages that align with our values. And so you're going to be naturally embracing the messages that align with your values, and you're going to think those are wonderful, and mostly they are, but, notice how the message is constructed to align with your values, right? Then down at the bottom, the next column, the cards, read between the lines. Oh, I'm an English teacher, right? Learn how to recognize the message that's not spoken directly, but is made to be inferred. Stereotype alert, boy, oh boy, right? Stereotypes are everywhere in media, and they have to be because media have to simplify information, right? So spot those stereotypes. Solutions too easy. Just imagine that blinking every time a message is oversimplified, right? Notice when messages and how messages are oversimplified. And then my favorite button, record, save for later. If the guys at MIT could make this for me, Andy, don't you think I'd be a millionaire? Yes, I'd be a millionaire because Americans have this baked-in set of values that you have to buy something. And then the more you spend on it, actually, the better it is, right? So if the guys could make me a remote control and they said, Renee, you can only have one button, I'd say, I want the record, save for later. Because in an attention economy, where there's information and entertainment and persuasion swimming all over the place, the scarce resource is my attention. So I only have so much time. I can barely get through my email, right? I only have so much time to pay attention to anything. And my attention is the scarce resource. I need to protect it. I need to skillfully deploy it for my benefit and for the benefit of my culture and community, and not be jerked around by people who know how to pull me into the rabbit hole with sex, violence, children, animals, UFOs, QAnon, whatever. So that's the quickest way to explain media literacy. And you already are media literate because you're here at Bioneers. But you have to figure out ways to explain those critical thinking skills to folks who just don't think about that when they're thinking about the joys and the pleasures of entertainment and information.
Boy, oh boy, this is just a spectacular demonstration of what's possible if you're motivated to do the work of this. Right. And I think that's part of the challenge with our media consumption now is it feels like work. But at the same time, I think my call to folks is that most things that are worthwhile take some work. Most things that, whether it's meditation or exercise or gardening, practice and toward some outcome takes work. And back in the 20th century, with Walter Cronkite just saying that's the way it is, that actually was lazy, right, and wasn't always the way it was. He was a wonderful journalist, but the networks had their motivations and restrictions as well. So I think part of this is just getting over the idea that information, Stuart Brand, there's this whole thing about information wants to be free or expensive, but it basically takes work. You have to invest time in making these platforms serve you. There's one button I think that might be missing, actually. Utility. Is this useful for me? And I think, to me, especially as a journalist, when I'm going through my email or scrolling at anything, I'm trying really hard to say, is this actionable? Is this giving me insights that if I share it with someone else, that might make the world a little better? Yeah, that's the rigor I try personally to apply, so I'm not wasting people's time as a writer, content communicator, et cetera.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting about what are the missing buttons. That's a topic we talk a lot about. One of the buttons that is missing, that Bioneers will recognize as missing and make sure to include it when you do media literacy with your constituencies, and that is the missing piece, the heart. How does this make you feel is a really important entry place for critical analysis, right? Because messages are carefully designed to make us feel. And because, well, at least when it comes to beneficial propaganda, good propaganda activates the heart, right? And I am pretty optimistic that in the years ahead, we're going to see artists and poets and musicians and singer-songwriters and people try to craft messages that speak to the heart and ways that help to unify us. And I think there are probably people in this room who are doing that. So thinking through the ways in which we encounter media at the heart level opens up possibilities for us to think about critical thinking. People sometimes say to me, oh, Renee, it's too much critical thinking. It's going to make people cynical. And it's like, what are you talking about? Right? It actually makes you trust and respect journalists more, because now you understand how carefully you work to make sure that that thing is accurate, right?
Thank you. We don't always hear that. But it is work. And that doesn't mean that everyone has to do that level of work, but having that attitude and that toward what you choose to share or not share or write or not write seems very valuable. There was a blogger, climate blogger, Michael Tobis, who's, when you have a comment section on your blog, you know, it's kind of like a playground that you get to set the rules. And his rule was, don't post anything unless it's better than silence. Which I really loved.
Oh, that's beautiful.
That's a great way of thinking about it. So I want to move to questions and the like, and also if you have insights that you want to share or links to stuff. And yes,
I'll be Oprah. I'll be Oprah.
Thank you. I'm Pfeiffer. I design social media impact campaigns, and I don't think this is how most people engage with social media, unfortunately. No. And I'm designing a impact campaign right now that's about misinformation. That's why I came to this session. And the approach that, like, I don't know, like I can't tell people to do these things online. It'd be great to have like a little pamphlet, but people won't do that. So like, would it be really terrible for me to use generative AI to make some misinformation that's right on the border of being something that's sort of ridiculous, but the whole world is kind of ridiculous, and then at the end of a very brief video be like, is this even real? Do you think that would be effective? Do you know of other things going on like that? Like, what other things can we do to be like a little bit more radical and grab people's attention?
Goodness. Yeah, go check out the game called Harmony Square, or one of my favorites, it's called Bad News. Just go get Bad News. It's a 10-minute online game. You're taught how to be a disinformation specialist. And you get points for the more creepy and awful ways that you share. And so the idea is we're going to help people sort of recognize how disinformation is constructed, and they learn these are the 8 techniques. And in doing so, researchers in Europe have found that can be very effective. So it's sometimes called pre-bunking, right?
Right.
Go for it.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Nani, and this question kind of comes from, I have a very dear friend who lives in Ukraine and was under occupation for a little bit. And for her, it's very, very important that she gets news because that's information about her safety. But at the same time, I'm wondering, like, how much is your media intake being tracked these days? And then is there a safety component that consumers need to, maybe this is catastrophizing, hopefully this doesn't happen in the US, but is there a safety component that we as consumers need to be watching out for as far as like what, if what we're consuming is being tracked?
That's a complicated question. I'm going to answer the Ukraine part, and we'll talk a little bit about the privacy tracking stuff together. Ukraine has had a really active engagement with media literacy for more than 10 years. In fact, when Europeans were just getting started, they were looking to what Ukrainians were doing, because Ukrainians were getting a targeted set of Russian disinformation that was designed to make them feel like they're not a real country, they're really part of Russia, and so forth. So Ukrainians kind of have a heightened sense of consciousness about the risks of getting a steady drip, 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 drip that, you know, each individual drip isn't that big of a deal, but together they add up to be a worldview that can be changed. And what they found was that teenagers who learned how to have conversations, critical conversations using these kinds of questions, were able to come back to their parents and teach it to their parents, which is a really cool idea of like how young people can influence their family members on developing media literacy competencies. Now, on the question of tracking, where should we start? In China, there's a lot of tracking, right? And even social credit systems where you get more points if you use certain kinds of media, and then if you don't use certain kinds of media, then you don't get points. And so maybe when you go to ask for a loan, or if you go to buy a car, the price you're offered is different. So social credit systems are a reality in China. They are and they're an experiment about how can you get people to do the right thing by creating a set of rewards, not punishments for using media, but rewards for using the right media. But in the United States, we don't have to worry about that, do we, Andy?
There's a bunch of questions
There's a bunch
everywhere.
of questions, so I'm headed up to the top here.
We'll try to get to as many as we can.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's fabulous. I'm a consultant who moved a lot of my work into the electoral sphere in early 2016 because I thought I could never look my son in the face if I didn't say I did everything to stop fascism, right? So this last election cycle, I live here, but this last election cycle I managed a congressional campaign in Michigan by design in a redder district in order to deliver votes to the top of the ticket as well as get a better hold in that district than they'd had before. And we did all of that, but the two things that really struck me that I'd love your insight about are, one, what you said about the phone, it's like our avatar, and I come back here and progressives genuinely believe that what we see here is what everybody else sees, and as a result, they are so effing superior talking about how stupid everybody was for voting the way they did. My junior high working class friends from Detroit, where I grew up, showed me what was on their phone. These black working class men, their feeds weren't filled with MAGA. They're insulated against that. It was truish, and it was things about you work hard and now your money is going for sex change operations or for better housing and health care for undocumented immigrants than you have. Or this is your man cave, your vote. Don't let anybody push you around, which was trying to insulate them against their black women telling them you're voting for Kamala. I mean, my nephew, who is in a super active Democratic family in a wealthy white suburb, he actually asked me, was Obama the worst president we've ever had? And he was 18, right? A senior in high school. And that was the induction going on for like a year or two for these people. So anyway, I guess my questions are for people that, what are the best ways to reinduct when we don't control like the big media so much? And secondly, as I'm engaging many of the people that I worked with in the campaign and old friends who supported Trump, there really is a distinction between people who care about civility and those who don't. And for people who care about civility, I can't give even a thoughtful statement of fact that isn't laced with a completely different mindset than everything that they've learned and heard in their thoughtful mindsets and with their deepest values. And many of them are religious, but not all of them. And I realized it's not like I can't just give them information. This is deep, long organizing. What do you recommend around all of this?
Wow. First of all, that's a really, really great observation. Yeah. It's important for us to understand the information worlds that people inhabit and to ask them to interpret the meanings of those messages, not assume we know what the meanings of the messages are, right? Because one big media literacy idea is meanings are in people, not in texts, right? That it's the act of interpretation that makes it meaningful. So we have to do inquiry. We have to say, how did you interpret that? Why did you think Obama is the worst president? Show me something on your feed that emphasizes that. And that's super hard because we've got podcasts, we've got social media, we've got so much fragmentation that even just to get people to share what media they are consuming is a challenge. But I think it would be well worth our effort. And that's what the bust out of the silos idea is really about, is learning what the trigger words are, what the trigger phrases are that stop people from listening, thinking, and being open. I don't know the real solution. You know what I do with my own students? Long ago, I stopped sharing artifacts with them. I use a tool called Padlet. It's a digital bulletin board. And I say to my students, every week, post me something from your social media feed. We're going to talk about what you see on your media feed, not what I, the old lady, sees on my social media feed, right? We're going to talk about what you see. And so my students really control the class because they show me the problematic text. They show me the text they love. I love this meme. Why? And we have a great conversation. I hate this meme. Why? We have a great conversation. That's especially useful because in my college, like many others, there's a big gender gap between boys and girls right now. Boys are living in a different media world than girls are, young women, and young men are living in different media worlds. And so they actually have trouble talking to each other, even though they're both all just 21, 22 years old.
That's amazing.
We have to find ways to break down those gaps.
Before you come down from there, maybe you could harvest 2 or 3 of the questions that were there, and then, so just in a row, and then you can offer some perspectives, and then I'm going to go up here and do the same.
Cool. Hi. This ties in kind of to what you were just saying. I teach 9th grade English. I know, I'm so brave. And I threaten to put my students' phones in the toilets all the time because they're completely controlled by their devices. And I guess I'm wondering if you have thoughts, like, I think they've all grown up taking media literacy classes now because it's this hot topic, which is great. And they still don't care about it. They see it as yet another thing they're being taught in school, like history of the American Revolution, like grammar. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how to get like people in that age range, the 14 to 16-year-olds, to really see the importance of this stuff. Yeah, I don't know.
Great question. So media literacy has been taught badly since the 1930s, really, when media literacy first came into American high schools. One really terrible way to teach media literacy is to say, you guys should read the New York Times. Like, that's the good newspaper. Don't watch that Fox News shit. That does not do a damn bit of good to a teenager, right? And so librarians are unfortunately sometimes accused of this, which is, it's a trustworthy site if it says .gov. Ooh. These days, think about that. Yeah. That's not good advice. So bad media literacy, I've documented, I have a scholarly article out on it. I didn't call it bad media literacy, I called it suboptimal uses of media in the classroom. Suboptimal. So good media literacy is student-centered. It uses the media that students experience, and it uses a process of questioning, dialogue, discussion, close analysis, and creative media production. And that is truly engaging to kids. So when it's done well, kids like it. Now, who else has?
There was, oh boy. So let's try to keep them brief, and we see. I'm gonna get a few here, and then.
Hi, I'm Daniel, and I used to work in sales. I sold solar systems to people's for their houses, and I don't think I was the greatest salesman because I was not very good at the emotional manipulation part. But I did have some experiences of starting with people who were not fully convinced and then presenting them with a bunch of facts. And then by the end, they were like, okay, let's do this. So I'm curious, what do you think was happening there? Because I'm sure there was something emotional happening, but I'm not quite sure what that was.
Okay, hold on to that thought. You and I thought there was more.
Something's jumping out to me is that we're hearing a presentation about why knowing about misinformation is important. And the way I understand the world is that everything's propaganda. And so I'm understanding this as a kind of propaganda. And I'm wondering about like the emotional appeals we should make when trying to persuade people that misinformation is something we should learn about. And it's like, I wonder if you all thought about how you're presenting this and how you're speaking to people's hearts while doing this.
That's a great question.
Wow, it's gotten really meta. Go ahead. Hi, my name is Ami. I'm in grad school and working on integrating mindfulness and Buddhist principles into conservation. When you did your role play in the beginning, it reminded me a lot of nonviolent communication, and I was wondering if you were familiar with it and what your thoughts on it were.
So those are three solid
questions.
Yeah.
It's three really good questions.
Okay.
And
we have about 15 more minutes, I think.
Oh my gosh. And does anybody else want to ask a question?
There's one
while
down
we're,
here.
We're letting them pile up here.
Yeah,
so we can think about how to answer them.
Oh, wait. Who are you pointing to? Way up. Oh, way up top.
Way up top.
Shout it out.
Okay, I'm going to go up that way. Hold on. And somebody down here.
I'm going to try to write these down.
Thank you. So I'm someone who has been kind of like militantly decoupling myself from algorithms for everything that y'all have been saying. I think part of what I wonder about often is like how can we from the outside look at what the propaganda landscape looks like? Like, are there tools that researchers use to see big picture what narratives are being pushed as a way that we can do better propaganda ourselves and understand the landscape?
That's a great question, and that's an easy one because the computer science propaganda guys do these network analysis, millions and millions of data points on a particular topic, and they map out the relationships between those arguments, and they help us sometimes see propaganda messages that are emerging in the ecosystem. So yeah, computer scientists are really working to take the data of clicks, likes, and shares and map it onto a sort of risk profile. So every month I get a newsletter called Active Measures. And Active Measures is the disinformation community around military and warfare threats. And they identify, here's some of the messages we're seeing Iran is expressing in ways that are getting across to people in Europe, right? And here are messages being sent into North Africa, and here are messages that are hitting Asia. So people are trying to map them and then predict them to anticipate possible risks. Who's the guy who asked about how are we propagandizing? Wow, what a great question. I can only answer it by saying I'm following in the footsteps of the grandfather of media literacy. He was this Greek guy. He lived like 2,500 years ago. And he had a school. You know, he was a teacher, right? And I'm using all three of his classic techniques. And you've observed that in this session. And so you should use these techniques too. Be like the ancient Greeks, right? Who told us there were 3 ways to persuade people. Logos, appeal to reason, evidence, and logic. Sometimes it does, right? Pathos, appeal to emotion. That's what the salesman struggled with, but you know, it's hard. Appeal to the heart, right? And then the third one is the one I find most intriguing. They called it ethos. Ethos is persuading through your character, through your presentation of self, through your being. And so whenever you're trying to persuade somebody, even if it's just to get a pizza, right? You're going to use logos. Let's go to the close one because I'm tired. I don't want to walk, right? You're going to use pathos, which is, I'm Italian and you're Italian. We should do it for our heritage. Or ethos, because if you want to be my friend, you'll do what I say, right? So ethos is being used in an overdrive kind of way because ethos is a way that acknowledges that we all have a need for belonging. We all want to belong. We want to belong. And that feeling of loyalty is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's how humans have survived for so long, right? Under threat, when the tribe is threatened, you gather behind the leader, follow the leader, and you'll survive. But ethos is sometimes called charismatic authority. Now, what do you think, Andy? Is charismatic authority a form of propaganda that we really need to learn to protect ourselves against? Why or why not?
Oh boy. Well, to me, there's 2 varieties of what you just described. I think journalists, especially now that we've gotten away from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal being the place you go, but to an individual, it's your established trajectory and sense of rigor. You're presenting a view of your own reliability, your track record and stuff. That feels like good. The bad part of is the word charismatic leads us into where we are right now with a salesman, the ultimate salesman now in charge of the planet.
Right.
So it feels like there's some divisions there too.
Right. I'm really optimistic about the future of influencers as having some opportunity here. Sometimes people put journalists at the top of the pedestal and then like influencers are like way down here. Mm-hmm. But I actually think that influencers and journalists represent two kinds of charismatic authority, right? One through the force of logos, right? Mm-hmm. Reasoning, evidence, and information. And the other, the influencers who work on our hearts, not because they have any more knowledge than us, right? Not because they know better than us, but because they are relatable, because they're more equal to us, right? They're just as dumb as we are, right? And there's something comforting in that. So I think understanding the power and the potential of influencers to help our movements and to our causes to thrive. I bet, raise your hand if you have an influencer that in your life that you really totally respect, love, and treasure. Yeah, you form a relationship with these people, right? It's a parasocial relationship where you know them, they don't know you, but it's still a meaningful way to influence people.
Bernie, yeah, right. So you had a question, yeah? I'll get.
Yeah, that leads right into my question. So I'm Wendy Knox Carr, and I write book reviews, which is like physical books, for the Berkeley Times, which is a paper magazine, which does not occur online. However, I do go online frequently. Anyway, my question is, do you think that Jeff Goldberg of The Atlantic was set up so that the administration could attack him, PBS, The Atlantic, and the media in general?
Whoa. Wow, that sounds like a conspiracy theory to me. No, I don't believe that. I believe that somebody inside that group recognized the power of journalists as truth tellers.
Oh, that's
and
interesting.
that's what I believe.
You think it was slipped in?
I think somebody in that group wanted a journalist to be in the room so that truth-telling could happen. Because the military are not really happy about this madness, right?
No.
And I have a friend who's in the Naval War College who says to me, Renee, it's ridiculous who's the head of defense, and it's not going to last because this person's not going to be credible. So that's my. So I have a different conspiracy theory.
Hold on in the back there.
Here.
Yeah.
Can I just shout it out? No. You speak into the microphone and give it all its rhetorical power, Christina.
Oh, yeah.
Go for it, girl.
All right, just because you talked about journalists being the source of truth, I want to understand from your perspective if you consider the New York Times to be a source of truth that would pass the test of what you shared in their little handout. Because don't you have to respond to all the people that are funding the paper, like all the sponsors we always hear on the daily, like the big oil companies that are there every time telling us how good oil companies are. And specifically around Palestine and calling Palestinians prisoners and not hostages. Like there's clearly some censorship going on there. And I wonder how you grapple with that given you're talking about misinformation.
Right.
With all due respect to you, but I'm just sitting here thinking about that.
Just to be clear, I'm not at the New York Times anymore. I was there for 21 years, but I don't want to let my profession off the hook. No, word choices are hugely significant. And I wish the New York Times had persisted with some things that we were experimenting with when I was on the staff, which I think would have helped a little bit. I'm not saying there aren't awful biases, et cetera. Back in the early 2000s, we had what were called topics pages, so that when you were looking at a word online like Palestine, it would go to a page that says, this is what we mean when we say Palestine. Mm-hmm. I'm just using that as a random example. Global warming. I used to moderate. I used to manage the page so you clicked on the word climate change, then you would see the New York Times official, this is what we mean, like our Wikipedia background thing for that word. And that all went away. Now if you click on Palestinian or whatever, it goes to a set of stories on Palestinians. There's no definition. And the best counterexample is a wonderful group called Global Press. It's a international network of female reporters who are trained and supported through an organization in Washington. And their style book, how we choose words, is all about getting past just tossing a word in there, like refugee or Palestinian or hostage or whatever. Mm-hmm. Their reporters learn to be very specific and not to just toss words around without showing this is what we mean when we say this. So this is just a sketch of what I think is problematic. in the news business today. And then there are, I mean, issues in terms of advertising bias and stuff. I don't think that's really there. The Times, you know, lots of mistakes, huge mistakes going forward, not all of which, as I said earlier, were acknowledged, even the big ones. But it's an institution that all the journalists I worked with there, editors and reporters, for many years, I wrote 2,000 stories or I don't know what, we're in pursuit of defining the state of the world. And it's different than reality because there's no single reality. So the institution, I think, is robust and worthy of existing, but with lots of problems and questions and ways to practice better. Go to globalpress.co, which is the homepage for the Global Press Journal, and you'll see these are journalists in Rwanda, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, and they're all women who are trained to tell stories from the ground up and to take photographs, and that means gets through some of those problems.
And TikTok and YouTube are places where new forms of journalism can thrive.
Yeah.
But Andy, I'm looking at the time, and I'm thinking,
I think
we talked for an hour and 15 minutes, and so many things we didn't get to talk about.
But you know what? You can come back on my show, and we can continue. No, seriously. Revkin@gmail is my email address, and for the questions that remain, send me a note. We will do a follow-up. I always see conversations as not leading to an endpoint. They're just revealed so many more threads to pursue. And my Substack thing, revkin.substack.com, which is called Sustain What? It's all about asking questions that help to take us forward through complexity, can continue this conversation. I'm glad we got to do part 2, but this is part 2 and an ongoing journey toward better practices, knowing that the whole environment is changing nonstop. We didn't even get to AI except for a few examples. So there's much more to talk about, and we can maybe make sure there's a track on communication and media here at Bioneers going forward too. So thank you so much for
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.